Yeah, and we are just going to jump straight into our next session. I am Bill McDowell. Hi, y'all. I am joined by Rosanna Case and Carrie Edelstein, will both introduce themselves in a moment. I'm going to start because my company has the name on the banner, so I get to do that. No, we are going to be talking about what I think is a fun topic. So Trevor just shared, pure method, these exercises that we can give to participants, cool analyses that we can do on the information that they share. But what if those participants don't exist, or are really bad, or are robots pretending to be real people? Like that's kind of what we're up against as research and insights folks, and that's the whole reason for wanting to have this next talk. So we call it the shit show that is research sample quality, but we'll just call it quality in general. This is what we're going to do. So you got myself. I'm going to play the role of sample provider or operations. I got the short straw in this sort of panel array because I'm the one who we're going to be fussing at and talking junk about. We're joined by Carrie, who is going to be our research agency uh, participant or representative. And then Rosanna, who's going to be our client sider, kind of bringing all these three perspectives. I'm certain that there's a joke about if the three of us were to walk into a bar, if somebody could drop that into the chat or the Q&A, you get the door prize for the day. I don't know. But yeah, actually, so speaking of chat, what I'd really like for this to be is not your typical panel discussion, right? So, if we're at an in-person, and this is honestly, I think, a good advantage of a virtual conference in this case. If you're in person, you're sitting in the audience, you're watching on stage, the experts talk and do their thing. You get an opportunity for maybe some Q&A at the end, but it isn't all that interactive. We can do that in this case. We've got the chat, we've got the Q&A. Let's all kind of weigh in and talk about what we've experienced, what we've seen, what we're up against, because we are all in this together. This whole data quality thing. Let's treat this as a big therapy session, right? We'll walk out of this. This will be cathartic. We're going to feel good. We're going to laugh. We're going to cry. But no holds barred. Let's just, talk about the reality of what we're up against and see if we can't, at least draw attention to it, raise consciousness, know that we are not alone, that, some of the hair pulling out that I especially have been doing over the past several years isn't isolated to just ourselves, right? So, like I said, I'm gonna kick us off real quick. I'm gonna walk through some, I don't know, state of the union or level setting. Accelerant, we ran a panel, or I'm sorry, a poll last week because, surveys, we don't give participants enough, we don't do enough. But basically just to ask researchers, and that's suppliers, clients, consultants, academics, UX, CX, MRX, all the different X's, what they thought about the state of data quality right now. So a couple hundred of them were gracious enough to give us some quick opinions, and it ain't pretty, y'all. What's the moral of the story? I mean, you look at what's in front of you here, and what, 4 out of 5 researchers or research users are saying that the state of participant quality is at best, and it kind of goes down from there. We asked folks, how has this changed over the past, several years, right? So, past 5 years, has the state of participant quality improved, stayed the same, or declined? And yikes. So past 5 years, 3 out of 4 saying that it has declined. In the past year, I don't know if there's a glimmer of hope to be had that, it got bad, and we'll call it even terrible during and post COVID, and maybe it's stabilizing. It's certainly not getting better, but I don't know that I want to hang my hat on that. We also asked a lot of just open-ended, like, yeah, share your experiences, tell us your feedback. And what we got a whole lot of was just, the talk about, purchasing sample or purchasing participants for research studies, and the cleaning exercises that must go after having received, we'll call them complete, right? And in some cases, we're talking about, folks that are doing this 25% of the sample that they are purchasing, they are removing for, a myriad of, different bad quality reasons. Some that are talking more in the 30-40% range. We've even got folks talking about like 70 to 80% of the sample that they are buying is unusable. And my word, people. I think about like I go to the, Chick-fil-A drive-through, or I'm in North Carolina, so let's go Bojangles. But I buy my four-piece, chicken tendies, I take them home, and I'm going to be able to eat, somewhere between one and three of them. Like that, in what world does that make sense? That's the whole point of what we're looking to talk about here. Next up is going to be Carrie. So Carrie did a recent presentation at SampleCon, which is, just a very, very compelling, I don't know, we'll call it theory or idea that she has as to some of the root causes for what we're seeing here from a quality slippage standpoint. I'm going to let Carrie introduce herself and kind of talk through.
Awesome. Thank you, Bill. And that was really interesting. I feel like I'm in the group that would have said poor. But I was actually just asked when we were at SampleCon, I was on a panel after my presentation, and we were asked, the four of us who were on the panel were asked if we believe that the state of sample and this issue with quality has gotten better over the past year or not. And it was interesting because I think people who work in sampling were like, yes, clearly it's getting better. We're addressing this. And then those of us who were buyers were like, no. Or I had the thought as you were talking, Bill, of like, we've stabilized the shit show. We've not solved it, or we've acknowledged it. We're trying to fix it, but I'm not observing in my own data that I have to do any less work to make sure we have good quality data and trustworthy data. So, and that is a thing I just, 20 years ago, I didn't really review my data to make sure it was right. I reviewed it for mistakes in the, in programming and things like that, but I didn't review it to make sure that people were actually humans. Like that's just kind of that would have been a crazy thing to think about in 2005, but that is a thing we pay very, very careful attention to today. But I was at a different presentation that was given at the CEO Summit that the Insights Association puts on back in, I think this was in the 2022 or 2023 summit, I forget which year. And I can't take credit for the couple slides I'm about to share. They come from CamVR Consulting. So those of you who know Simon Chadwick, this is his brainchild, not mine. But as these were being presented, I had this kind of aha of what's been happening in our industry. So I'll share these couple slides with you. See, and they're not going to be in full screen mode because I want to be able to see you and my screen at the same time. But can you give me a thumbs up that you're seeing the screen? So this is what they showed was essentially the ownership structure of the research industry. So not the brand side, but sampling companies, research agencies, et cetera. This is who owned them 20 years ago. So there were some that were public companies. I used to work for one of them, Harris Interactive, went public while I worked there. And then several of them were corporate owned, so big corporations, and then many like the one I own now, and Bill, I think you're in the same boat, were privately owned, and just a tiny bit of private equity was starting to come into the industry, and no venture capital at that point in time. And then they showed us this same distribution for 2022, and it looks quite different. You start to see that it's mostly private equity and venture capital that now own the research industry. And there's actually quite a bit more public, but there's still some corporate, very little privately owned industry anymore. That's really just the small businesses that remain. So I started to think to myself, like, wow, that is such a profound shift in ownership structure in our industry. And really about the financial incentives of that. And this is one of the other slides I showed. I'm toggling through here, but one of the other slides I showed at SampleCon was the definition of private equity from the American Investment Council. And it talks very specifically about the idea of private equity ownership intentionally having a 3 to 7 year ownership cycle. Now, I've owned my company since 2011. So we're in year 14, and I sometimes still feel like we're a startup. And Bill, I know you've been at this even longer than I have. So to me, like when I had the 7 year mark, we were just finally like getting started and like knew what was up, and it kind of had, we felt like we were off to the races. At the 3 year mark, it was still kind of like, what are we doing here? And so that's very, very early stage to take on a company as an owner and expect to flip it that quickly. And so one of the things I believe has happened in our field is that this ownership structure, in particular private equity, but also to a degree venture capital, is motivated to grow and sell, not innovate and sustain. And data quality is an innovate and sustain exercise. It's not a grow and sell exercise. And I think there's a misalignment there with the organizations that own sample companies and what we need out of data quality, that I don't actually know how we reconcile that under that ownership model. My whole presentation was actually about, we need to go back to owning ourselves. Can we even solve that which we don't own? Because the goals of private equity are operational efficiency. It's not innovation. It's not coming up with new ways of finding people. I floated a question at SampleCon last year to another panel that I was not part of, but just from the audience. Like, how can we innovate in sampling to be more representative without technology? And nobody could answer the question. 4 senior executives on stage and no one could answer the question. 3 of them used the word technology in answering the question, which drove me a little bonkers. And there are some really obvious answers, like partnerships, right? You need more young Black men, partner with HBCUs. That's huge here in the Southeast. Why are we not thinking a little bit outside the box? And the answer is, that's a more expensive way to do it. It's more operational overhead. It's not as efficient, but it would lead to representation. It would lead to certainty that these are real people, and that would lead to data quality. And we're just not doing some of these things because the ownership structure of our industry now, in my estimation, is totally at odds with what the ownership structure needs to be in order to make those investments that are not going to be as high margin, right? It's going to be a little lower margin, but it's going to be more sustainable. And I think that's just kind of a fundamental disconnect that we need to reconcile as an industry. I will stop sharing my screen. And that's kind of my high level feeling on what I think is happening in our industry. And we can spend all this money to fix fraud, but it's, in a world where owners want to spend money on tech and they have to spend money to fix fraud, that means they're not spending money on real innovation, on doing things differently, on thinking about how they could bring new people into the mix, and how they could be more representative and less duplicative of the same panelists taking your surveys over and over again. They're putting that investment money to fixing a problem rather than harnessing an opportunity. And so I think our money is being spent. I mean, it's being spent on a necessary thing, but ultimately we are spending money to fix the problem that ownership structure caused in the first place. That's my mic drop.
Hey, drop it. Go for it. Yeah, Rosanna. All right, so you're the representative of the corporate side. You've gone through your career in stints at what, Time Inc., P&G, Duracell. What have you seen over those years?
Yeah, awesome. I'm so excited to be here and join the conversation especially with Carrie, who's so passionate about it. I love it. I'm just over here soaking it in and learning. But great to be here, guys. My name is Rosanna Case. I've spent 14 years in kind of client-side consumer insights work at Procter & Gamble, and most recently at Duracell. I'm now doing some independent consulting. But this is a really interesting topic for me, because I feel like over the years, it's not the part of strategic insights work that we've talked about a lot on the client side. But over the past few years, I've come to see it as like part of my value proposition as a strategic insights leader, right? Like, it's not necessarily the cool, flashy stuff like that we bring to the business team, right? That like ensuring we're asking the right business questions and executing with foresight and driving insights to implications and action, right? Those are the things we'd like to talk about on the client side as far as the value we bring to our business teams. But over the past few years, I've come to realize like part of my value is just making sure that we are executing what I call decision grade research. Like, are we making sure that we're partnering with the right suppliers, that all the right processes are in place to ensure that we're making decisions on data that is good and valid? And we don't talk about it a lot because at one point, I think it just seems like a cost of entry, right? Of course, we're doing quality work, right? Like, of course, we work in insights and we're doing quality work. But it's a huge part of what we do and kind of the value that we add. Making sure the data is good, making sure that every study is designed kind of with an eye toward our category or kind of our business need. And I've joked with some senior leaders in the past, kind of joked, but like a lot of it is reality of like, do you realize how much you would be making decisions on bad data if I weren't sitting in this seat and making sure that, one, we're partnering with the right suppliers that have that eye towards sample quality, or that we're coaching our supplier teams on the nuances of our category that necessitate kind of changes in methodology. So I think it's something I'm excited to talk about it. Like, I think it is truly like a piece of the value equation that we bring as client-side researchers.
I love that. And, it's funny, I wrote a piece for the Insights Association blog, I think is where it ended up being published. I should share with you. That was all about sort of brand side researchers like owning that power that you talked about, and not kind of, I know you and I have talked about software as a service, kind of being like, that's the client side job. Just, get subscriptions and do everything yourself. But it's like, well, okay, but then you don't have the time and the bandwidth to really review everything in that level of depth to make sure it is decision grade. I wrote that down, by the way. I'm going to totally co-opt that from you. Decision grade research, I think, is a phrase we need to just socialize out, right? And that actually takes work to really monitor. And I think that gets a little obfuscated in a DIY environment where there's just stuff coming through and you don't necessarily know where the sample is coming from. A lot of those software companies, those tech platforms, will tell people that they have a panel. They do not have a panel. That's not even true. Like, it literally is not an asset on their books. It's partnership like anyone else would have, just like we have as an agency. And Bill, I know you and I have talked about this behind the scenes, but I actually had an intern a few years ago do a secret shopping exercise in the sampling space just to see how many people were lying to him. It's like most of them were just totally misrepresenting what they could do. And they were just taking other exchange, sample from exchanges and things like that and marking it up to like $8 to $10 CPIs, but they were paying like 50 cents, and then they're like, we have our own panel and it's really well vetted. And that's why it's $8 to $10. But like, no, they don't. They're just making 1,000% markup on this stuff. So it's kind of nuts what's quietly happening behind the scenes. And I think, to your point, I really love the attention that you put towards recognizing that, the job of a brand side researcher is to make sure that that's not quietly happening behind the scenes, so that you have defensible research to make big business decisions, right? Like, if you're off by a couple percentage points, let alone 5 or 10 or 15 percentage points, which can happen in these scenarios, that changes marketplace outcome to the tune of millions of dollars sometimes.
Absolutely.
We can't be off by that level of error. And, it's one thing to have sampling error. It's another thing for the sample to be erroneous, and I feel like sometimes we are not making clear the table stakes of getting that wrong. And I really appreciate that your worldview has been, defend that ground and make sure that the organization can trust consumer insights. Because I think that is something that I see happening less and less at different Fortune 500 companies. They don't realize how bad it is and aren't giving it the attention you gave it. So I appreciate that you're carrying that torch.
Yeah, absolutely. No, I think it's having hard conversations sometimes, right? Because we always talk about, right, the trade-offs between speed, quality, and cost, right? They're all moving, in continual triangulation. And yeah, I mean, with technological advances, I mean, Carrie, you do a great job talking about like tech timidation and asking the right questions just to make sure that we as researchers understand exactly what's going on. Like, it's like you need, as a researcher, to understand exactly how this is working, right? Like, so asking those questions and understanding that, but a lot of times it is an internal conversation for me around kind of speed, quality, and cost, right? And just staying up to date on what is available, because we are continually improving, right? There's continual stuff that's coming out, right, on the best ways to learn with consumers. And so you got to stay abreast of that. But there is going to continually be this speed, quality, cost trade-off. And it's a conversation I have with business partners all the time, which is like, yeah, we can do it cheaply, or yes, I can have you an answer tomorrow, but I don't know that that's an answer I want to make a decision on.
Exactly.
And, part of it is right-sizing learning plans to risk reward. Like, what do we already know? All of these things, right? As a strong insights partner that you're filtering things through. But
Yeah, and it's also understanding like what are the hidden costs, right? I think there's a lot of hidden costs to some of this stuff. So, you brought the most important one, a wrong decision is a massive hidden cost, right? It's not so hidden once it happens, but it's hidden before it happens. And the other thing I think is like the time that it takes you to do some of these things. So, I remember being at a conference where there was a presentation on the cost of DIY. And the presenter went through all these little hidden costs, but none of them was labor. And I was like, when you factor in the cost of DIY, do you factor in the time and the salaries of the people doing it themselves? And the answer was no. And I was like, do you think client-side researchers work for free? Like, their time is valuable. They make a salary. There are payroll taxes and office space costs and benefit costs and all these things on top of that. And you're valuing their time at zero. And you're also valuing the opportunity cost of what they would be doing instead at zero. And that's like, those are two major hidden costs that I think sometimes we just don't calculate in all of this. And I think it's so important to really like do that calculus correctly. But in particular, I think your point about, the hidden cost of making the wrong judgment call on that is probably the one that backfires the quickest and can lead to long-term distrust in the insights industry overall.
I love that one on opportunity cost too, though, because I think that's a big one as a client side researcher, depending on, the size of your team and the size of your scope, right? Like if you're learning on one thing, you're not learning on something else, right? And so we have to make sure we're going after the biggest, most impactful business questions and decisions that we can influence. And if they're big and impactful, they need to be done rigorously, right? And you want to be talking to real consumers and answering them in a rigorous way. So,
but that didn't used to be the role, right? Like, I mean, there was a time when the corporate insights professional could just trust that what they were purchasing. I mean, the quality, piece of that, quality cost speed triangle was more about, is this going to be a good report that's, well written, or am I going to have to redo this thing? It was just an understanding that, it was going to be real people taking part in my research, and it wasn't going to be, just completely wrong. So, I mean, that skill has been, a relatively new one that has to be polished. And I mean, I love the decision discussion because, I mean, ultimately that's, there is going to be some sort of reckoning, unfortunately, about all of this, right? Like, I mean, a new Coke level decision is going to be made based on garbage research or garbage data, and there's going to be a down the chain sort of, reckoning for it. I personally have no interest in being, part of that, business school case study for decades to come. But like that's what someone has to be tasked with, kind of protecting for. And Rosanna, if an organization has been smart enough to bring in someone, with your type of attention, that's great. But there are a lot of organizations who, are bringing in insights folks who are less seasoned, who maybe don't even know to even ask these questions, and they're relying on suppliers who, in some cases, I mean, when you hire your supplier, you have to not only be, thinking about their quality, but also the quality of those who they subcontract to, right? Because I mean, it can be a brilliant research team that you're working with, but again, if that raw material that they are purchasing is flawed, it's going to make its way to you. Terrifying.
Yeah, it is. And that's actually an observation I've made. I feel like you're like this bright light, Rosanna, in an industry where a lot of people don't have your attention to those specifics. And we've seen that play out in a lot of ways. And one of them, to your point about it didn't always used to be this way. I think the tech and Rosanna, you mentioned tech intimidation. That's like a phrase I coined. Because
sorry
I
to steal it, Carrie. I knew you were going to use it. It's yours.
Socialize it out. Let's make it a thing. But for those of you in the audience who don't know what that is, it's this idea of like tech companies intimidating you into thinking you're missing something when in fact they are missing something. And so the thing I hear most often is like, the condescension of like, you just don't get it. You just don't get what we're trying to do. And I'm like, well, I don't get your business model, but I do get what you're trying to do. And I think you don't get that it's not working, and sometimes I'm just like, you're right. I don't get it. I don't get why this is sustainable, why it will work. Explain that to me. And they can't, and that's sort of the point I'm trying to make. Or they talk over you in jargon or acronyms to make you feel stupid and, make you think that you don't deserve to be part of that conversation, which is just, patently ridiculous when you're the one spending money to buy that tech, like actually I'm your customer. Like that skepticism is a form of feedback, and you should be listening to it if what you're saying isn't landing with me. So that's where the whole tech intimidation thing came from in my mind. But I think it just speaks to, sort of a bigger issue that we've been overlooking, that part of tech intimidation in my mind is spreading this idea that every decision has to be made fast. It's the whole agile culture. And there are absolutely some decisions that need to be made by tomorrow. Like I do a ton of work in media and used to do a lot of work in the entertainment industry where we'd be test screening a show that was going live next week. And so, yeah, the producers needed the results of a test screening the next morning because they were reshooting or recutting that day, to be live next week. And so, yeah, that made sense, right? That some of this needed to be really quick turn. But sometimes I'll see a company building, a really elaborate e-commerce platform, and they're like, I need the data by Thursday. I'm like, why? This is like a 2-year long build out. Like, there is literally no consequence to you getting it in a month versus getting it in a week, and it like this, you're not going to get to the point in your build out where you're using this, before that point. So why is everything a rush? And I think we've a little bit lost that ability to discern what actually does need to be quick turn and what doesn't need to be quick turn. And frankly, what shouldn't be quick turn, because you can't possibly cross all your T's and dot all your I's if you do things too quickly. And also, I don't think, and Roseanne, you can speak better to this than I can, but I think some brands actually don't have the bandwidth to act that quickly on things. So when I hear about these like nightly fielded studies, I'm like, who has the bandwidth to make a different decision every day? I'm like, maybe weekly, but more likely monthly or quarterly at best, these things are going to be addressed. Yet these companies are out there being like, you need new data every day. And I'm like, do you? Like, could you possibly act that quickly and nimbly? Do your decision processes even allow for you to act that quickly? Or is a chain of command too slow or relying on people who are bottlenecks, which is more often the case? So I think there's been this intimidation of you need this thing that's agile and quick, and that is sometimes true, but it is not categorically true. And to your point, I think we sometimes like we've lost sight of when it is and when it isn't, or maybe the ability to discern when it's important and when it's not. And sort of, we're being told it's important all the time, and I don't really believe that as a business owner. Like, not every decision I make, I'm dealing with needs to be made tomorrow. And in some cases, I'm like, get back to me in May. This is not a mission critical decision. I've got other fish to fry sooner. And so I know as a business owner, it can't possibly be true that every decision has to be agile.
Yeah, and Carrie, there was a heyday of, purchasing sample where, I could be spending, $2 a complete. I could be getting, whatever audience I desired, and I could field a, very high sample size survey over a weekend, be back Monday morning and have, some pretty clean, good looking data in front of me. That has changed, right?
Yeah.
And we are now, to your point on time, having to not only, not be able to achieve those quick turnaround goals for data collection, but we are adding on, the need to now take our data and, analyze them to be able to analyze them, right? I determine first if it's even, what we intended to collect, or if, again, to the, the results of our survey, like, am I having to throw out, 50, 60, 70% of my results, go back to field and get more. That weekend fielding is gone at that point. So, we've gotten spoiled. It's setting in that, the actual reality right now, and much of it is our own doing and our industry is doing, but, where do we go from here, right?
Yeah. And also like that, that aspect, whether it's 30, 40, or 50%, takes time to identify who. It's not always super obvious, right? And, we've run into that at our company, that there's a level of expertise in the subject matter you're studying really required before you do the study to even identify who's faking it in the study, right? Which can get really tricky. So an example I'll give on that is, like I said, we do mostly media research. And we had a study about a year ago, maybe a year and a half ago, where all of a sudden overnight we had like 200 Native American men, 18 to 34 with college degrees come into our study. Now, it just so happens that I'm also a consultant for a Native American media company out in Alaska. And we had just done a bunch of work with them on their listener base and like who's in it. And so I learned a lot of information about the Indigenous community in America and what their demographics are. And one of the things I learned is that they are less likely to be college educated, not more likely. And that's actually something they're trying to work through. And so I'm looking at this data. I'm like, why would this group over-index on college education? They should under-index. And also, Native American men are a very, very small incidence of the population. How do we get that many in that quickly? That doesn't seem logical. And my team, not knowing all of the things I had just learned the week before at this Indigenous client, where I happened to be, doing a retreat with them, they were like, "Oh, this is amazing. We got all these, Indigenous responses. This is so great." And I was like, "That's definitely wrong." Right. But you don't have the experience of working in that community to know that data is absolutely incorrect. And so not only did we have to be knowledgeable about media, we had to know every demographic, how they consume media, and what their profile looks like in America. That's a lot of layers of expertise I had to have to flag that right away. And, I started to think to myself, like, what do you do if you're a junior researcher? Like, I have 25 years or more of experience, almost 30 now, of experience in this. So I start to flag that stuff pretty intuitively. But somebody who has 2 years isn't necessarily going to know all that. So how do you even flag these things? And I would say I actually rely on my clients a little bit to flag when something looks off. Because, Rosanna, you're going to know much more about the battery market or the CPG market than I would. And you're going to flag when something's like, that is way too different from my other 10 studies to be right. And so then there has to be this very open relationship between agency and client about the magnitude of fraud so that we can have a conversation about it without an agency feeling guilty for that being the way it is when we're not actually in control of that. So we're beholden to it too. So I think there just needs to be better communication so that we can do that, but we got to build it into timelines. I now build fraud fixing and data cleaning into my timelines, including the possibility that I need to refield to get some more data if that's wrong. And that means, to your point, Bill, there's no fielding over the weekend, right? We're not getting that done over the weekend unless we're just lucky that we didn't get hit with a fraud attack. But more often than not, I'm like, I want a full week, because we could have Monday morning and realize this is all wrong. We got to go back in the field Tuesday morning after we fixed it. And now we don't have data till Thursday, and so we're trying to build that into timelines, but that's hard, in a situation where people want intel to make a decision, next day, 2 days later. It's really hard to find that balance.
Yeah,
There are other aspects. I don't know if you want to go into this, Bill. I don't want to go off discussion guide, but we're talking a lot about like sample fraud, right? Like, are the people that we're talking to the people that we think they are, right? Or are they bots or, whatever. But I mean, I think that's only one aspect of quality, right? Like
True.
the other aspects of quality take time too, maybe even more time, right? Which is, I think, am I talking to the people that I want to talk to? Like, are they real people? Are they engaged? Like, they might be real people that are the exact demographic or, profile of who I want to talk to, but are they engaged and like giving me quality answers?
And reading the questions.
Are they reading the questions? Am I designing my survey or, whatever it is in a high quality way that's going to kind of give me the best possible chance of getting those high quality responses? And then related to that, but I think of it in a separate bucket, is sort of, am I being realistic about what I can learn from these consumers, right? And ensuring that that's quality checked too. And I'll give you an example on that one is, I most recently worked on the disposable batteries category, which, as you guys know, is so fascinating, right? Like, I'm sure you as consumers think about disposable batteries like all the time, right? Like, no, you don't. Like the average consumer thinks about disposable batteries maybe for, a minute every 4 times a year, every 3 months, right? You're going to spend 30 seconds at the shelf to buy some when you need them. And that's the amount of mental space that they're giving to the category. So we put a lot of effort into, like, we recently revamped our brand tracking program. And I was adamant that we are not asking consumers a 20-minute survey on disposable batteries, because that is not a category that they think about for 20 minutes. And I'm not going to bury a KPI that I'm going to make brand decisions on at the end of a 20-minute survey, right? So like the thought and thinking and category knowledge that goes into that, I think is an important aspect of quality too. And all of it takes time.
Yeah, that's such an important point, because I think back, I mean, kind of to triangulate that with what Bill was saying earlier too. When I've been working in online research since the late 90s, because I was at Harris when they were starting to do this stuff with the Harris Interactive in like 98, 99, that era. And, in that first decade or so of online research, we used to soft launch every study or pre-test every study, not just to make, to get a sense of incidence rates and stuff, which we still do now, but in survey length, but we would actually kind of stress test some of the questions to make sure they were clear and understandable, and that, or not correlated with each other. Do we need all these questions if they're correlated at a level of like 0.9? Maybe we can combine a couple things or cut a couple things. And we would really spend a day or two looking at soft launch data, clean up the questionnaire, and then full launch. I haven't been given a window of time to do that in 15 years, and to your point, right? And so that's a really interesting point, that from a data quality standpoint, that aspect of like attention when you do have a real person is real. I would say attention, and then personal relevance. Like, are you asking the question that's how they frame things? Or are you kind of going down wonky jargon lane? And that's just like, that's how you talk internally, but it's not how people talk externally about that category.
Yeah.
And yeah, I sort of miss the days where I got to learn from the soft launch, improve the quality of the survey instrument. Or if it's a qualitative study, right? Maybe you're doing 6 focus groups. After the first one, you meet, you debrief, you clean up the guide. Sometimes we have the time to do that now, but oftentimes it's like, no, we need all 6 groups in 2 days, instead of over 3 or 4 days, so that you can actually like iterate and kind of take your time to make sure the guide's working. And I think in all forms of research, we're just kind of rushing to field on stuff and not getting to spend time making sure. That's a great point, that like you're hitting the quality part that's actually more like attention and relevance and relatability, so that you're getting good data back from people.
Yeah, and fighting to be a part of the conversation. Even all right, so we talked about software as a service and platformatization, but DIY survey tools exist. And Julie dropped an interesting comment in the chat that's in line with a lot of what we're talking about. But I know Rosanna talked about being the steward or the protector of these bad bits of information from making their way to the folks that you're supporting internally, the decision makers. But Julie talks about the pressure that is coming from those decision makers, that, get this stuff turned around quickly, get this stuff, because I got to make these decisions yesterday. So, and if I am sitting in marketing strategy operations, and I can just go grab myself a SurveyMonkey free trial and zip out a survey written horribly, but at least get some data back in the time that, I'm unwilling to bend on. What does that mean, right? So like, I mean, our job as researchers is to now like be everywhere and try to maintain our relevance and stay involved. And it is not an easy thing to do.
No, and you bring up a good point, that some of those platforms also don't have the functionality to enable quality. So like SurveyMonkey is a perfect example. Like, I won't use it on anything complicated because there are certain types of randomization or block randomization or question randomization that I can't do in that tool, that something like, well, they're not all Forrester brands, but Decipher and Confirm It were built to do. And so I know that if it's a really, really basic thing, I'm just trying to get, a short list mistest from a newsletter list of one of our clients. We just want to kind of get a sense of, how often do you read the newsletter, right? Yes, you can use SurveyMonkey for that. But if we're really getting into things where there's order bias and things like that, or we got long lists or competitor lists, things like that. You've got to have something that has all those rotations and randomizations built in. And it's like you've got randomizations on your randomizations sometimes in order to do it right. And not all of the tools enable that. And not all the tools enable nested quotas either. That's another thing that I run into. So for those who don't know, nested quota would be like, instead of saying you have quotas for age and gender and race and ethnicity, it's age by gender, by race and ethnicity, knowing that those things have confounds. So, and I started doing that. All you need is one study where like, all of your people of color are women and all of your white people are men, right? Or something like that. And I had that happen, not to that extreme, but to a pretty big degree on a study, probably 15, 20 years ago now. Like only has to happen once before you're like, nope, I'm not leaving that as a soft quota. I have to nest these things or I'm going to get wild swings that introduce confounds that I don't know what to make of. And they can't be controlled with data weighting because we actually don't have enough people in some of the cells to do data weighting. And there are a lot of tools out there that cannot handle nested quotas. Like they don't build it into the platform. And then that could also not handle data weighting if you want to use their dashboard. And so that kind of speaks to your point, Rosanna, of like another quality issue that even if you do get the sampling right, or you have real people, you may have the wrong distribution or the wrong representation of people for that, marketplace, whatever that might, whether it's batteries or TV shows, and I think that's part of it. And one of the comments I made to a sampling company that was complaining about this was like, well, why are you selling directly into those platforms instead of around them to agencies and clients who will fix that? Why are you selling through those platforms when they're going to wreck your data? Why aren't you doing some training with them and holding them accountable and setting standards for who you'll sell to in order to maintain that integrity? And the short answer is because my venture capital or private equity owner wants me to scale as fast as possible and would lose their minds if I did that. And I go back to my first point of, I don't know how you reconcile that when you are not owned by people who care about data quality, but you're owned by people who care only exclusively about scale to the exclusion of data quality at times. But we just, to your point, both of your points, we spend a lot of time just intervening on that as much as we can. And, I've coached my team to assume everything is wrong and then be delighted when it's right and just look for what's wrong and be really vigilant about it every day that we're in field so we catch it before it comes out of field, and to only use platforms where we can set that up front. But I think when some of these software companies are selling direct into not just end clients and research, but like in our marketing teams and our product development teams and so on, who don't have that rigorous training and they're going around research teams, all of a sudden research pops up in a different discipline and it hasn't been designed properly. It's got bad sample, fraudulent people or not real people. And then it's also architected poorly. And so you get this layer on layer of all the data quality issues in one place. Speaking of shit show, right? Aptly named presentation, Bill.
Well, and like, all right, I'll throw another one at you, but that is going to be we talk a lot about, our own selfish needs and what we desire to do with these data and how we're applying and what processes we're putting in place to try to fix. But, just also the quick timeout to think about this from the research participant standpoint, like the participant experience in our industry. Like, it ain't pretty. I mean, think about, the journey that one takes to, to get to a data point, right? Like, I mean, and especially the myriad, like, steps and platforms and rerouting that a single participant can go through in order to even make it into beginning a survey or a bit of research. And, let's talk about incentives for a hot second, but like think about $2 sample for a minute there, right? Like it's been something that can be purchased. Now, that is what you would be paying for someone to complete your survey. Now, I can go out and buy a half-hour, survey complete among, a low-ish incidence among the general population for $2, right? U.S. minimum wage is what, $7.25 these days? Half an hour for $2. how much of that $2 actually makes it to the reward pocket of the person who's actually taking part in this research. And man, that's rough. A half hour qualitative IDI is going to get somebody, in many cases, $100, right?
Yeah.
Why would I be getting like, Chuck E. Cheese reward point or two for that same half hour if I'm sharing it in quantitative research? I mean, that's something that it's going to have to be fixed at some point. I mean, these folks are effectively, we talked about subject matter experts in our last presentation, but you're hiring these hundreds of mini consultants to give their time to you, and you are paying them nothing in many cases, and that's not right. I don't know what is to be done,
It's
right?
disrespectful of your customers too, right? In the end, right? It's kind of disparaging of the the customer you're trying to win over, isn't it? And I was reading Ivan's question in the chat that kind of, to me is like the solution being offered to this now, which is synthetic data, which I don't personally believe in yet. I think the fundamental challenge of, so first of all, I want to back up and say I hate the phrase synthetic data because it sort of dehumanizes the customer. And it's also not synthetic, it's just modeled human behavior, right? That's what synthetic data is. And we have to give everything a new sexy tech name, right? Tech imitation. And my feeling on that is I think it will work in some areas where big data can model, so I saw a couple people presenting at SampleCon, big data creating digital personas, and then you ask the digital persona something in much the way you might talk to a chat GPT. And that, I think, at a certain point will be interesting for some very specific use cases that involve observable behaviors on the internet, spoken about on the internet or in other public forums and transcribed. But I think when you get into things that are very future thinking and are more attitudinal in nature, or more the kinds of things people don't speak up about and keep to themselves, I don't know how you model that which isn't observable, right? That doesn't make any sense to me as a statistician. And so I think it's an overpromise that will likely be underdelivered. And then I also think they're going to run out of data to feed in. So at a certain point, like, you're using existing surveys and data to then feed this quote synthetic data, but at a certain point you're going to run out. And so that's kind of a talking point now. It's like a year from now, you're going to run out of data because you've eaten your own baseline, you've eaten your foundation, and then what, and then where does this go? So I think it fills a very specific area. Like, I'm interested to see where synthetic data goes, and maybe allowing us to predict 5 minutes of questions from 15 minutes so that you don't have to ask a 20-minute survey. You can ask a 15-minute survey. I think that kind of missing data, computational work is starting to show some efficacy in certain areas. And I'm kind of curious to see where that goes. And I think modeling, big data sets in certain areas could be really interesting as well, but I don't think it applies everywhere. So I don't think it's going to be a solution to this problem. I think it's going to be kind of its own opportunity that harnesses big data in a more effective way. But I don't know that I think it solves the data quality problem in what we're doing. I think, and if anything, you're modeling the bad data with more bad data, right? Like, I don't know how that really solves anything unless you have something super credible, or as you put a decision grade, Rosanna, to then model upon, and most of that's confidential. Like, I don't even know where you'd get that data from. So I feel like it's an overpromise.
Yeah, no, Carrie, I was thinking the same piece. Again, like, I love your reframe of synthetic to kind of modeled human behavior. I'm stealing that one. But it creates, again, the need for transparency, right? Like, as we get into these kind of modeled behaviors, modeled data sets, like, what is it modeled off of, right? And how are we ensuring that the data it's modeled off of is real data, quality data?
Exactly. Garbage in, garbage out, right?
Yeah, and to that point, like, I think that's that visibility is where we kind of have to be headed as an industry. Like, having the right as a purchaser of research participants or research sample or whatever, having the right to know where and how they came to be, right? Like, I mean, there was a time when you could E-rewards was one of the, first panels that came into existence, and, much of their sample came from relationships with like frequent flyer programs, and they were validated and they were real people. They had their biases, sure, because of, having been sourced from, singular locations, but we would kill for something like that these days just to have, real people. So, I mean, we demand it from our, consumer goods that we buy, but I think it's something that needs to begin happening with regard to the research data we're purchasing, and that's just understanding from whence it came, right? Like, I mean, how did this this stuff come to
Yeah.
be, come to make its way into my survey?
That's actually what I used to love about e-rewards, is that they were so transparent about where it came from, that when I knew I needed a sample base that was higher SES, that maybe six-figure households, and I had some clients that were literally travel clients trying to reach six-figure households with, cruise lines and things like that. I was like, oh, we should definitely go to e-rewards because they're going to have people who are interested in travel and make six figures, and they're going to be easier to screen for, because I know that's a bias you want in this study. It's a nice parallelism there. And so I could specifically reach out to them and work with them when I knew I needed that. And it wasn't great if I wanted to do like a national sample, like a polling kind of thing. No, they were totally the wrong panel to work with. But for a lot of our clients, they were absolutely the right one to work with. And I think it gave us as researchers a little bit of that empowerment to do that matching in a way, and to think strategically about it. And I feel like we're just missing that transparency today. And I don't even think it's that our sample partners are trying to lie to us. They do not know the answer. If I ask them where their people came from, they cannot tell me. And, I got the idea at SampleCon to ask it in the survey. And I'm like, I might start doing that. Like, maybe consumers will tell me how they got into the survey and where they were recruited from. And we can get an idea and whether or not there's bias to that and get some transparency there. But I mean, it really seems to be the case that account managers at sample companies do not know where their actual real people even started. They can't tell you where they sourced them from, which is hard,
It's terrifying for sure. And it's funny. I mean, I'll put my old head hat on for a minute as well. Like, I can remember when online research became a thing. And it's funny that, the initial fears about doing research on this internet thing was not knowing who your participants would be, right? They could be lying about, their identity or whatever. And it's, fast forward to today, and we've actually like, created some kind of self-fulfilling prophecy where we've actually like, as an industry, allowed for that very thing to take shape. Now we're purchasing data that we've all now agreed is, the way of doing research online, that we can no longer trust that it is genuine. And yeah, whew, good times.
And on that happy note.
Yeah, all right. So we're coming up on time, and let's talk about happy notes. I mean, what's being done? What do we see as the future? What glimmers of hope can we look for out there? I mean, I know a couple that I've seen. For example, are these, I call them uprisings, but it's, just groups getting together and starting to demand better. I know Insights Association, they've recently uh, published this participant bill of rights. Is just a thing that, honestly, read through it, and it's quite sad because it's very low bar for what should be the experience that people taking part in research are experiencing. And like I say, read through it. I highly recommend, because it is, it'll, I don't know, bring a tear to your eye. I know, Rosanna, you mentioned, we were talking earlier this week, things happening at large end client purchases of research, like P&G, starting to create their own standards, or data quality, just deal breakers that, with an oomph like, and purchasing power like a P&G, they can start to do something like this, and hopefully the rest of the industry will start to catch on.
Yeah, and I think one thing we talked about, Bill, is the more in the space of synthetic data or AI and modeling, just data labels, right? Like, just like, again, this sort of
Mm.
idea of radical transparency on where the data is coming from. And I think that can be applied across a wide variety of, whether you're modeling, creating, models based on a data set, or even what you're talking about, Carrie, right? Just asking the question, where those consumers come from, and just demanding kind of more transparency and understanding.
I mean, that was honestly something that, as blockchain has started to become a thing, that got me most excited about the technology, and that's the possibilities from a research standpoint to, if my non-tech novice understanding is correct, we would have the ability to actually, authenticate people, and where I'm purchasing them from, I can know because they have that tag that they are indeed genuine. And wouldn't it be super cool if I didn't have to, waste the first, 5-10 minutes of every survey that I field asking the same screening questions over and over again, which this person who's taken part in the research has been asked a zillion times. Like, you know, my birth year hasn't changed in a while, I think, right? Like, I mean, that's not something that I should ever have to answer again, but we do it because these are going to different sources and different data sets, and it has to be asked again and again and again.
Yeah, I agree with all that. We can see it in our data too when that happens, because people drop out at question 1, question 2. And that's the indicator that, I'm probably the 5th time they've been asked it. I will say I do feel like there's a lot of attention in industry towards this now. There's tons of data quality initiatives. I really appreciate there's a floodlight being shown on this in a way that didn't exist a couple of years ago. And so I feel encouraged in that direction. I also think there's going to be a boomerang back to classic panel-based research like we used to do, because it worked and it wasn't as cheap. But now the alternative is actually no longer cheaper because we're spending so much money on fraud. So I think there's going to be some of that boomeranging back over time, which is encouraging. But I think also, and clients are becoming hip to what's happening there. And there's this demand, as you said, Rosanna, for radical transparency that I think is going to start to become the norm. It's not going to happen overnight. It's going to take some time, but I do feel encouraged that the people like myself and you, Bill, who've been speaking out on this and concerned about it for a while, like, I got to keynote at SampleCon and bring this all on stage. And I don't think that happens 2-3 years ago. I think we got to a tipping point where they want me on stage because everybody's really nervous and we need to have an honest conversation. And so I feel like that's the starting point, right? Is that the people who were kind of dismissed as skeptics are now being heard as maybe the early adopters of understanding the writing on the wall. And I think there's a little bit of a pivot that's taking place that I feel encouraged by.
I mean, sample source, like, I started a research agency with absolutely no intent to get into the sample game. Have been sort of forced into starting to build a panel just to be able to help with initially some qualitative research, but then kept building it because frustrations kept growing, and always intended for that to be one among many mixed method sources to be able to do research. And we've built a nice sized proprietary panel, which, until visiting SampleCon a year, 2 years ago, my thinking was ours was an adorable little, panel that's great. And it turns out it's one of the largest, at least proprietary in existence. And that's not a good thing. I don't like that. And we're certainly leaning into building more and more sample to be able to deliver real people into real research. But man, the sources of getting these data are getting scarcer. So we got to figure this out. Are we coming up on time?
Thank you. Yes, and I have to go to another
Thank you.
presentation.
Rosanna, any parting shots?
No, I mean, last bright spot is like when you get a real consumer who's willing to share a real story, whether it's, qualitative or part of a quantitative survey, man, I mean, that's why I do what I do. So
Amen.
really encouraging that we're continuing to find those real people that, can
Love
give us
it.
the insights to drive action.
Thank you. Thank you for having us.
Thanks for your
Yeah,
time,
thanks,
y'all.
Bill.
I don't know if we solved anything, but we certainly had some fun. So that's good. Appreciate it, y'all.
Bye.